We've heard a lot about GovTech and all of this very macro level thinking, but how does Arkham in particular fit into this integration process?
So I think Arkham as a company is actually a bit of a bridge and a way to facilitate the transition of cryptocurrency from being this more kind of decentralized private technology to the kind of thing that can be used more broadly and have the blessing of large institutions and major powerful players such as the government. And so part of the reason why I wanted to give a presentation on the nature of technology and the fact that it tends to start out privatized and decentralized and then later becomes centralized and used by the government is that I tend to believe that this sort of thing is inevitable. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to give the historical and contemporary examples of how these sort of pieces of technology that start off very private eventually just become pieces of government technology. And I think that the same thing will happen to cryptocurrency, and there's no way of avoiding it. And so, from my perspective, the best thing to do is to make that transition as simple and as easy as possible, and to continue to be friendly with a lot of the powers that can do things such as suppress your technology and cause them to fail. I would love to see cryptocurrency continue to become adopted, for the markets to remain healthy, for people to be able to build different kinds of cryptocurrency technology without necessarily facing a ton of regulatory pressure. And so I think that Arkham actually plays a very critical role in helping people to understand more about what goes on chain and within the cryptocurrency markets, and build a significant amount of trust, both within players and individuals within the cryptocurrency space, but also outside of it, such as existing financial institutions and governments.
So you obviously work with governments as one of the core sort of value props, but what is, in your experience, the prevailing attitude that you find from government actors? You mentioned circumvention, suppression, and integration. Where would you say that the majority lie?
I think overall, governments have been really focused on the overall, not necessarily the development of cryptocurrency technology, but rather trying to limit the spread. And so one way in which they have done this is via those kind of centralized gateways in which people get access to cryptocurrency or try to get out of it. And so one of the things that's sort of a key characteristic of crypto right now is the volatility. And then, one other sort of element of the cryptocurrency space is that, frankly, it's just not very easy to live your life fully in the cryptocurrency world, right? You can't currently, the majority of people don't pay rent in crypto. You can't, go buy a coffee, pay for a cab, or buy airfare or hotels, right? And so you need to off-ramp into some sort of fiat currency. And the fact is that governments have a stronghold not only on the creation of currency overall, but also on how it spreads. They have capital controls. They have different laws around money laundering and how much money that you can transfer to, from peer to peer or person to institution without it getting reported. And they can create laws to limit the off-ramping of cryptocurrency from exchanges for individuals, which can be very painful. If you get deplatformed off of every major centralized exchange in crypto, that's a very bad spot to be in if you hold a lot of crypto. And so overall, I think they try to basically suppress and make it more difficult for people on the on and off ramps if they're not necessarily being compliant and following the rules.
So on the question of sort of circumvention on one side and then suppression on the other, we've got a large group of people who often tend to have been here from the start, or from the start, who are very much sort of like the founding fathers, let's say, of crypto, who really push this idea of creating a whole separate financial institution that's completely separate from government and that doesn't have the characteristics that are sort of core to the existing financial system, being central banks and fiat currency. Do you see there being a resolution of this conflict as we progress to further integration, or?
I think overall it is not necessarily a solution. And the reason why is because in many respects, crypto has actually just recreated the existing financial system and has sort of exchanged the powers behind it, right? And so in many different ways, crypto actually has a lot of the things that the traditional financial system has. So it has different kinds of central banks, so to speak, in that every single protocol has some sort of creator that dictates, the relevant, supply of the currency, how much gets burned, how it gets distributed, and that's one of the powers of, the central banks globally. And, again, as I mentioned during the presentation, there are, a number of different examples of different services that have been built in crypto. For example, exchanges. We have exchanges in the traditional financial system for stocks, for example. And additionally, different ways to kind of bank yourself, right? A place where you can custody your funds, a place where you can lend your funds in exchange for interest, and then a place where you can borrow in exchange for paying somebody else an interest rate, and you get access to liquidity. So all of these things are pieces of infrastructure that exist in the traditional financial space that have now been recreated in crypto. It's just that they have a different set of people who manage the technology. And that isn't to say that it's exactly the same. I do think that, across traditional financial rails, there's significantly more bloatedness, significantly more kind of bureaucracy, and potentially significantly more corruption as well, globally. And so I think that a lot of these things have been removed and improved in the cryptocurrency space, but I don't necessarily think that it is a complete resolution, and I actually think that where we'll continue to go is just complete integration.
Okay. So going back to the idea of historical examples of technology becoming GovTech, you've got the discovery of the New World via ships, the Protestant Reformation via the printing press, and then the rise of the Medici via double entry accounting. Where do you see in the very far future, in terms of the progression of crypto and its potential, where do you see the most, let's say, high leverage uses of crypto for government technology?
So I think overall, crypto has a variety of different use cases that are relevant to different people. I think in one case, for example, with my last company, Reserve Protocol, that's an example where cryptocurrency can be used to fix monetary policy, right? And so in the case of countries such as Venezuela or Argentina or Lebanon or Libya, and now most famous would be Turkey, there's failed monetary policy. And that's why the inflation rate is so rampant, and why so many people aren't able to, save their money over time, and instead have to resort towards, fleeing to other kinds of assets, in which case the government actually implements different kinds of capital controls in order to prevent them from doing that. But crypto can actually save a number of different people in this respect. And in the case of Reserve, has actually, managed to get in the hands of, over 1 million people and tens of thousands of merchants. But the way in which it can be useful to governments in particular, maybe they don't necessarily want better monetary policy. It's, maybe better for them to just be able to continue printing as much money as they want in order to fund their, overinflated budgets. But one thing that is indisputable is that the asset tracing and tracking in cryptocurrencies and blockchains is orders of magnitude better than in the traditional financial system. And so what you see in normal financial rails is you have a number of different players across different brokers, across banks, across stock exchanges, and a number of different places where people can custody their assets. And so all of these places have their own black box servers where people, where they can get access to it internally, but a third party can't get access to the data without, for example, having a government warrant or subpoena or some sort of judicial power granting them the approval to look at the data and look at the information in order to do intelligence gathering on asset tracing and what people are up to. Right. The other thing is that it's much more complicated to go to, 10, 15 different players. In some cases, people set up entities, offshore and abroad in order to obfuscate their funds and how they're being moved around. But in the case of crypto, the fact that everything is in a centralized ledger actually makes it significantly easier for the government, right? And not only is it in a single place, they can actually just look at it without any kind of warrant or subpoena. You can just look at the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, and see what people's activity looks like. In some cases, it'll land in a more sort of centralized wallet, like say, for example, the hot wallet of an exchange such as Coinbase or FTX. But then they only have to go to one player. They pick up all of the information on the blockchains. They use the information on the blockchains to then go to a judge and then have them issue some kind of warrant or subpoena, which they then take to the exchange and say, we have all of the evidence of somebody money laundering or committing some sort of financial crime through your exchange. Please reveal to us all of the transaction logs and what this person is doing on kind of your platform. And so this actually makes the asset tracking and overall intelligence of the financial system significantly improved for the government use case.
So the narrative of crypto for criminals could be completely inverted.
I do believe it's completely inverted. I think there's actually two parallel narratives running in the space. One of crypto as completely sort of public and transparent. One of it being completely private, and the fact that you can't really see anything, and that crypto is great for crime. I think both of these things, both of these narratives exist in parallel. But the reality is that for the overwhelming majority of users, especially those that aren't necessarily too focused on obfuscation, it's the former. Yeah.
So it's interesting you mentioned sort of government interests and then hyperinflation and where those two things might cross over. I mean, I remember my first sort of experience of hyperinflation was A-level economics. Teacher holds up a Zimbabwean dollar, which is a $1 million note, and it's worth as much as a £1 coin. And obviously in that case, it was good for the Zimbabwean president at the time to print as much as possible, but for everyone else or people who you might say were concerned about monetary policy, that was an issue. And there's often perceived to be quite significant misunderstandings between people, let's say, in crypto or in the crypto industry, and then the sort of chasm between them and the government's perspective. So what would you say are the sort of main misgivings or misunderstandings that we find within crypto and vice versa?
I think overall, one of the things that governments don't necessarily understand about crypto people is that there are a number of different reasons for why people can be in the cryptocurrency space, not just necessarily because they want to conduct criminal activity. And so I think that there is a sort of broader sense in the overall public sphere and within governments that the only reason why anybody wouldn't use all of the existing financial infrastructure that exists, but would instead opt to use a cryptocurrency is because they want to hide and they want to do something illegal, essentially, right? They're not actually modeling the fact that it's, it might be because everything else is incredibly, bloated and bureaucratic and very kind of difficult to use, and the UI and UX for any given customer is awful, right? Like the people in crypto are much more kind of technologically sophisticated than you would see in, your sort of run-of-the-mill traditional bank. And that means that they build really beautiful products that are way easier to use and look at least potentially are even more sort of auditable in terms of where your funds are and how exactly they're being distributed and deployed. And in some cases there's actually just a direct financial incentive. For the majority of banks worldwide, they aren't paying interest on people's large amounts of capital within the bank. And as we've seen in the crypto space, there are a number of different ways to actually receive yield on one's capital, and yield that can be orders of magnitude higher than you'd receive in a bank. And this comes with its own whole set of issues, right? We all know of different examples of different sorts of assets and platforms that have offered very high yield and then exploded because on the back end you actually had some sort of Ponzi-nomics going on, so to speak. But there are also a number of centralized, very established, legitimate, audited, regulated players who still offer, even if it's a couple percent of interest, that's still orders of magnitude higher than you would find in your bank. And the overall user experience of that is going to be a lot better than you would find as well. And so I think that that's one of the main things that government people don't necessarily understand about crypto people. And then I think vice versa in terms of what people in crypto may not understand about governments is that they have interests that are more broad than, let's just say, having a very nice UX and making more money, right? Like there's a number of different agendas politically and internally, for example, national security, for why they may want to not necessarily move fast and break things, but instead regulate and make sure that everything is safe and legal.
So on the topic of the risks of high yields, we've obviously quite recently seen the collapse of algorithmic stable coins like Terra and Beanstalk. And then we've got more recently still the rumours of insolvency of 3 Arrows Capital and then Celsius, of course. I mean, stopping withdrawals altogether. What do you think about what's going on in the market at the moment? What do you see is going on?
Well, that it's a complicated question. I think that there's a lot going on. You can't necessarily point to one single thing that is causing sort of the dramatic pullback that we've seen over the past several months, and more especially over the course of the last week. But in terms of overall my broader sense and suspicion of what's going on, I think it's mostly related to global macro. I think the fact that there was access to very cheap, if not free, capital over the past 2 years made a really dramatic change in the market. Right, when money is free to borrow, when there's no cost, the incentive is to borrow as much money as possible and then to leverage into volatile assets that can make you rich. Right, and so now that central banks are pulling back and we're seeing significant sort of rate hikes, now there is a cost to that capital, and it's becoming very expensive. And so people are needing to de-lever, and they're needing to kind of reel in all of their different assets and investments, and that means scaling back. That means selling all the stuff that you were super leveraged into, where now the return may not necessarily be worth the interest rate and the cost that you have ahead of time. And so all of this is causing this broader asset bubble that we've seen across real estate, across crypto, across equities. Everything has dramatically inflated over the past 2 years. And as we see this deleveraging across all of these risk-on assets and a flight to the dollar and a flight to quote safer and lower yield assets, you're going to watch everything pull back until we're successfully delevered, and then that'll be the time to buy in and reap all of the gains again in a more healthy way.
Yeah, I can confirm that I have also been wrecked. So just for clarity, I can confirm I've also been wrecked. But regardless, there is this VC-backed narrative of like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, and you cited the examples of Facebook and Amazon as having been very successful in integrating themselves as government technology or slightly less complementary, like state capture kind of vehicles. And we look at crypto companies at the moment, and many of them are very much nascent and fetal. But to what extent would you say that their integration with government could be considered to be analogous with Facebook and Amazon? And to what extent do you think that they will also be adopted as GovTech?
So I think that it depends on the institution. I think for the most part, we've seen this transition from the kind of more complete decentralization of cryptocurrency, where you would get Bitcoin and other sorts of assets either directly from miners or peer-to-peer or by mining it yourself, to these more kind of centralized exchanges. And I think the centralized exchanges themselves, there are a number of different examples that point to the fact that they moved from being more private and decentralized and less regulated, kind of being more independent, so to speak, before they actually get integrated into the government, to moving to being more integrated with government, more regulated, and overall kind of less independent. And so you could see this change. For example, when I got started in the crypto space, BitMEX was actually the #1 crypto exchange in the world. People would often say that the Bitcoin price was just whatever the price of Bitcoin was on BitMEX, right? That was the only market that you had to look at to understand what was going on at least in the Bitcoin market. And there was a time when you could get on BitMEX with no KYC and onboard as much money as you wanted to and trade as much as you wanted to and get out, and nobody would ask you any questions, right? BitMEX is now, nobody really uses it anymore. Now, the main global players, I think I would say are Binance, FTX, and Coinbase in that order. There are some other exchanges such as Huobi and OKX that also get, a ton of traction. But the fact is that you cannot onboard onto any of those services without following very stringent KYC, providing some sort of ID, providing a passport, proving that you're not an American citizen, sending them, a selfie and having them run facial recognition on you to make sure that you are the person who you say you are. They run periodic checks at random intervals to, redo your KYC and make sure that you're still the person on that account and that you didn't sell it to somebody else. And so all of these things make it kind of, overall much more difficult to get onboarded unless you're looking to be regulatorily compliant. And so we can kind of look at, exchanges as one of the ways in which, it can be very easy to build a piece of technology and get a ton of users. But ultimately, in order to scale and in order to survive, you need to work with the government and the relevant regulatory bodies.
So there are lots of, we might call it lessons from history that we've found today in the presentation, and you clearly look to history often when you want to interpret the future. To what extent are you informed by historical examples and by narratives of history when you're making decisions and sort of formulating strategies as an entrepreneur?
So I think all of these different examples that I provided show the sort of similarities and patterns that you see across time, where, you know, even though you think that you're starting something very unique and is very novel and it's a new piece of technology, there's a lot of the underlying methodology and sort of broader sociological infrastructure that are still in play. You still have a number of different individuals who can be users or customers or citizens of a particular jurisdiction. You still have global powers. You still have people that are very rich who you need to borrow money from in order to accomplish your mission. And there are still things that, you know, need to be built and are new ideas. And so there's a number of different ways in which, you know, historically, you know, the fact that there are startups is not new. There have always been, you know, groups of people who have a particular mission or idea that they need to, you know, recruit people for, raise money for, go about and then actually execute successfully, and then, you know, redistribute funds to whoever they need to redistribute funds for, and then make sure that they have the blessing of the government so that they don't go around stepping on people's toes and then get, you know, locked in jail or something, right? And so all these things have been important historically and are important today. And so for that reason, I think looking towards history to see, you know, what are the different patterns that you can analyze? Where do we fit into these patterns? How have people been successful in the past in navigating their own sociological and technological territory? How does that inform my ability to more successfully navigate my own situation? And so I think that, you know, that has been very important for me as an entrepreneur. It's important to us as a company at Arkham, and is very kind of integrated into the Arkham culture. For example, you know, we have a book club with all of our different team members in order to, you know, continue giving people the space and the ability to, you know, get historical context so that they can better, you know, make informed decisions in their day-to-day life. And so I think it's one of the highest leverage things that you can do as an entrepreneur and as somebody working on an important mission.
Okay, so I'm very wary of time, and I would also like to see the reading list of the book club, if possible. But I am very wary of time, so would anyone like to ask any other questions? Jean?
Thank you for your talk, Miguel. My main question is, where in the world, just in terms of tangible context, where in the world do you see the best kind of governance of crypto?
I mean, there's a lot of options. Some are more populated and powerful than others, but in terms of just where I see the best governance related to crypto more broadly, at this particular point in time, because these things are very subject to change and there's been a lot of moving around of the pieces on the board, so to speak, but I think the United Arab Emirates has the best cryptocurrency policy globally right now. I think some people go too far in terms of regulation. For example, in the case of China and just the complete ban of cryptocurrencies, I think you just end up getting sort of a bunch of, you know, brain drain from that, people wanting to leave your country and then going and trying to build somewhere else. We've seen this in Singapore, for example, like a number of people, now that Singapore has become more strong from a regulatory perspective on cryptocurrency, people are now fleeing Singapore and going to Dubai, for example. And I think that, you know, in many cases, especially with the different European powers, they're just too slow, right? They set up a ton of red tape, a ton of regulatory barriers, and just overall are not very quick to the punch in terms of being very clear about what the regulatory situation is in their jurisdiction, which as an entrepreneur poses a existential threat to one's business. And so it's much better, you're much better off as an entrepreneur to run your business in a place where the regulatory environment is very clear and you're not going to get some sort of, you know, bad legislative rep later down the road. And I think that the UAE has been, you know, very quick to the punch in terms of making it very clear that all are welcome to come to Dubai and come to Abu Dhabi and build out their company and raise investment capital and trade with cryptocurrencies. It's an incredibly friendly environment in terms of tax. And so one of the big incentives for people who deal all day with currencies and trying to make money is that other people don't try to take that money from you, right? And in many cases for people in the crypto space, that means also, trying to make sure that, they do as much tax optimization as possible. And so the UAE has a clear kind of tax regulatory framework for, how they do taxation of crypto. And that's why you're seeing a number of different companies and in the crypto space and different traders and individuals also moving to the UAE and starting to hire people, and their economy, at least with respect to crypto, is booming because of it.
Any other questions? Alex?
How does the US, UK, and Europe's regulatory regime differ?
So that's an interesting question. I think with Europe, as I described, I think overall they're much slower and much more wary of cryptocurrencies overall. I think that the sort of general European culture is such that they don't look towards entrepreneurship as much. It makes significantly more sense to be a part of an established institution, an established kind of business. You go through your normal path of trying to go to college. Maybe you get a grad degree. Maybe you go and you work for a consulting company or an investment bank. And then you stay there for 20 years and you don't necessarily go and start a startup and do something super risky. And so as cryptocurrencies are seen as super risky, it makes it much more difficult for them to understand why people would want to build crypto businesses and go about distributing cryptocurrencies to the local populace. And so they want to be much more kind of careful about that. In terms of the UK, I think the UK has been more forward looking at least. They recognize that cryptocurrencies are here to stay. And that it's potentially an important part of the economy, but overall there are sort of procedures with bureaucracy and the sort of internal politics of the UK means that they can't actually move very quickly on making very clear legislature and making sure that they're actually bringing in as much talent as they possibly can as quickly as possible and inviting as much capital as possible into the United Kingdom, which poses some problems. And then in terms of the US, I think the US has broadly had this environment of, let people do what they want and be slow to, giving some kind of regulatory guidance. But then they look later on, you have this risk of them retroactively looking at your conduct and looking at your actions and looking at your business. And if you did something wrong and your intention was malicious, then you get crushed. Right, so that's kind of the overall U.S. regulatory framework. It's let people build what they're going to build. We'll look at it later on, and if you did something bad, you're going to go to jail. And I think that's overall how the U.S. has been looking at it, which, from an entrepreneurial perspective, actually I think makes quite a lot of sense because you can go out and you can build and you can tinker and you can, have the U.S. be your sandbox. And as long as you maintain, the spirit of the law and try not to, cause grievances to anybody or cause significant amount of harm, I think you'll actually get by pretty well.
And we have time for one more question. So Miklos?
Yes, actually to follow up on Alex's question. You kind of responded to the EU sort of landscape, right? You didn't necessarily talk about all of Europe. There's smaller countries out there. Even in the EU, of course, Malta has very specific regulations. There are other countries which are not part of the EU, but kind of associated. So do you see them moving differently or using their size to leverage that?
Yes, I think overall you're going to get, in terms of like crypto regulation, you're going to get the same sort of environment that you get in the traditional financial world. So you have a number of big kind of global players who all have these large kind of regulatory frameworks and tax bodies that are looking to track all of the different assets and make sure that they're getting all of the tax revenues and so forth. But again, in the traditional tax world and financial world, you have all these smaller entities and these smaller jurisdictions that are much more lax. So examples of that might be most famous, the Cayman Islands. Second to that, maybe Monaco, the British Virgin Islands, Jersey, and as you just mentioned for crypto, Malta, right? And so all of these places, they're small kind of tax havens where people can go and try and again sandbox or try to protect their capital and all of these sorts of things. But the reality of all of these jurisdictions is that they still fall under the authority and kind of purview of the much larger and more powerful government players, right? And so, for example, with all of the different entities in, say, the Cayman Islands or in Panama or in Monaco. Over time, governments have become much more strict from a banking and overall AML perspective in a way where all of the benefits of those places have kind of gone away, right? So for example, Switzerland was a big player and still continues to be a big player in the financial world, but the whole like secret private numbered bank account thing for Switzerland got completely destroyed after 9/11 and after the financial crisis. Anybody who had numbered bank accounts essentially then started receiving letters from their bank that their assets were frozen and that they would need to provide some sort of identification in order to get it back so that they could comply with global money laundering and bank secrecy laws, right? And so that's an example of which a small jurisdiction that tries to offer some sort of competitive advantage can still get, can still be required to comply with the powers that be or otherwise, face serious penalty, which includes, fines being cut off from, the rest of the global financial system. Like all of these things make it very problematic to work with these much smaller players, even if they have, a kind of competitive advantage. The other thing is that, in many cases, they kind of provide this illusion of being a safe haven. But like I just said, if you use it as a safe haven and then you do things that are very wrong or very illegal, they can still punish you retroactively. And so anybody who used, for example, those Swiss bank accounts in order to say fund terrorism or do other things that were very negative, all of that became unraveled. There were a number of investigations and many people went to jail afterwards. And so overall, the laws of the largest players still stand no matter where you are.
Okay, we have one more question. Do we have time?
Sure.
Francesco, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, on the point of governments, what do you think of centralized digital currencies? Because I don't know, I saw a video of the Bank of International Settlements, and they seem to suggest that it's the next way forward. And what is your view of democracy following this, and the fact that a government could literally freeze you instantly your bank account just because your opinion on something is wrong according to that?
So I think overall, cryptocurrencies have a number of different value props. During this talk, I've talked a little bit about the store of value, having it as a medium of exchange in places where monetary policy is broken. And then one of the other things is kind of self-custody and being able to if you have your keys, it's your coins. If it's not your keys, not your coins. And so my overall opinion of these centralized kind of central bank digital currencies is, not your keys, not your coins, right? And so, all of the implications of that stand, which is that if you use a more centralized digital currency, you don't actually have self-custody. They can freeze your funds, and it has a lot of the kind of similar pieces of regulatory infrastructure that just your bank account has, and that centralized ledger that they have of your finances has, right? But some of the other things can still stand. So for example, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is what's going to happen, but could be an example of having a central bank digital currency that is better than our existing fiat system is, they create some sort of CBDC and implement some kind of very clear monetary policy, right? And so they, for example, limit their ability to produce significant amounts of inflation. Maybe there's some kind of hard cap on the currency. And this means, moving away from our fiat system and going to a more kind of hard currency system. And, I think that's very unlikely. But that's an example in which they could create CBDCs and then actually have it be useful for the public rather than just being centralized banking in, sheep's clothing.
Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed the talk. We're going to head off to the Varsity Club now, and please could we have one more very warm round of applause for Miguel. Thank you. Thank you.